The tracks were still there, the signals still rusting beside the rails, and the old wooden building remained at the edge of town like something everyone had quietly forgotten. I was 23 at the time, recently back from the city after realizing things hadn't worked out the way I'd hoped. The night job at the station was one of the only steady jobs left in town, so I took it without asking too many questions. Most nights were exactly the same. I would unlock the office around 11, turn on the dim overhead lights, and sit at the desk beside the window that faced the tracks. The station always smelled faintly of old wood, cold metal, and the kind of dust that settles into buildings that haven't seen real activity in years. Outside the window, the railway stretched through the valley like two thin silver lines disappearing into the forest. Nothing had passed through those rails in years. The schedules had been erased, the signals shut down, and the company had officially declared the line inactive. My job wasn't to operate the station anymore. It was simply to make sure no one broke into the place while the railway company decided what to do with it. Most nights, nothing ever happened. That's why the sound I heard around 2:30 in the morning didn't make any sense. At first, it was just a faint vibration beneath the wooden floorboards of the station. Then came a distant metallic rhythm, slow, heavy, unmistakable. Anyone who has lived near a railway line recognizes that sound instantly. Steel wheels moving across metal rails, somewhere out in the dark forest beyond town. The strange part wasn't hearing a train. The strange part was that no trains had been scheduled to pass through that station in 5 years. But the vibration kept growing stronger beneath the floor. And when I walked to the window and looked down the abandoned tracks, I saw something moving between the trees. A single white headlight. A train was approaching the station, a station that had been closed for years. Before I tell you what happened that night, there's something you should understand about places like that station. When a railway line shuts down, the trains disappear, but everything else stays behind. The tracks remain buried in the ground, stretching through forests and towns like something the world forgot about. The signal posts stand there rusting, the platforms collect dust, and the buildings, ticket counters, waiting benches, old clocks on the wall, sit quietly as if they're still waiting for passengers who will never arrive. Most people pass places like that without thinking twice. But when you spend long nights alone in one of those buildings, you begin to notice how strange the silence can feel. Before we continue with the story, if you enjoy mysterious encounters, strange historical cases, and unexplained events hidden in forgotten places, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Here on Inside the Mystery Archive, we explore stories that feel like they came straight out of old records, events that were witnessed, reported, and then quietly buried in time. And while you're listening, I'd like to ask you something. Tell me in the comments what city and country you're watching from. I always find it fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to that winter night in 1978. The station was quiet, the town was asleep, and the forest around the tracks had gone completely still. According to every railway record that existed, no train should have passed through that line again. The route had been closed, the schedules erased, and the station itself was only standing there because no one had bothered to tear it down yet. But sometime around 2:30 in the morning, something began moving along those abandoned rails. And by the time I realized what it was already too late to pretend it wasn't real. Our town wasn't the kind of place you'd notice on a map unless you were already looking for it. Back in the late 70s, fewer than 2,000 people lived there. It sat in a narrow valley surrounded by thick forest and low hills that turned completely white during the winter months. The highway passed several miles away, so most travelers never even knew the town existed. The railway had once been the only reason people stopped there at all. When I was a kid, the station used to be the busiest place in town. My father worked at the lumber yard near the tracks, and sometimes he would take me down there on Saturdays just to watch the trains come through. Back then, passenger trains stopped twice a day, one in the morning and another just before sunset. The platform would fill with people carrying suitcases, travelers stepping off the cars, and conductors shouting instructions while steam drifted into the cold air. For a small town, it felt like the entire world passed through that station. But by the early 70s, everything had changed. The railway company slowly began shutting down smaller routes as highways and trucking became more profitable. One by one, the trains stopped coming through our valley. Freight traffic moved elsewhere. Passenger routes were canceled. Eventually, the station that once brought life into town became just another quiet building sitting beside a stretch of unused track. When I started working there, the place already felt like something left behind by another time. The wooden platform creaked under your weight when you walked across it. The station sign still hung above the entrance, but the paint had faded so badly you could barely read the town's name anymore. Inside the office, an old brass clock still hung on the wall above the ticket window, even though no one had sold a ticket there in years. My job wasn't really about operating the station anymore. It was more like being a caretaker for a building that the railway company hadn't quite figured out what to do with yet. A few pieces of equipment were still stored in the maintenance shed, and the company wanted someone around in case vandals or scavengers decided to start pulling copper wiring out of the signal posts. That was about the extent of the responsibility. Most nights followed the same routine. I would arrive just before 11, unlock the office door, and turn on the overhead lights that buzzed faintly whenever they warmed up. The station always smelled the same: old wood, dust, and the faint metallic scent that comes from years of machinery and oil soaking into the floorboards. I'd start a pot of coffee, open the maintenance logbook on the desk, and spend the first part of my shift checking the platform and storage shed to make sure everything was still in place. After that, there wasn't much left to do except sit and watch the night pass. The office window faced directly toward the tracks. From my chair behind the desk, I could see the rails stretching both east and west across the valley before disappearing into the forest on either side. On clear nights, moonlight reflected off the metal rails just enough to make them visible in the dark, like two pale lines cutting through the snow. Around 2 in the morning was always the quietest part of the night. By then, the town had been asleep for hours. Even the occasional car that passed along the distant highway seemed to vanish from the valley. The forest would settle into a deep silence broken only by the faint sound of wind moving through the trees. On that particular night, the silence felt heavier than usual. Frost had begun forming along the edges of the platform, and thin patterns of ice crept across the lower corners of the office window. I remember pulling my coat tighter around my shoulders while I finished filling out a routine maintenance report in the logbook. The coffee in my mug had already gone cold, and the ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder than normal in the quiet room. Outside the window, the tracks were empty, just like they had been every night since I started working there, and then the floor beneath my boots vibrated. At first it was so faint I thought I might have imagined it. The wooden boards beneath the desk trembled slightly for a second before becoming still again. I stopped writing and sat there quietly, waiting to see if it would happen again. For several seconds nothing did. The station remained silent. Then the vibration returned, stronger this time. It traveled through the wooden beams of the platform and into the legs of the desk like a low hum rising from the ground itself. And a moment later, I heard something that instantly made my stomach tighten. A distant metallic rhythm, slow, heavy, steel wheels moving across metal rails somewhere out in the darkness beyond the forest. Anyone who has ever lived near a railway line knows that sound. Even miles away, the rails carry the vibration long before the train itself appears. But the moment I recognized it, one thought ran through my mind. That sound shouldn't have been there, because trains didn't pass through that station anymore. For several seconds, I stayed perfectly still in my chair, listening. The station around me had returned to complete silence, as if the sound I'd heard had never existed. The clock on the wall continued ticking steadily, and somewhere outside a branch scraped lightly against the side of the building in the wind. For a moment, I almost convinced myself it had been my imagination. The human mind can play strange tricks when you spend enough hours alone in a quiet place. Then the vibration came again. This time it was impossible to ignore. The wooden floor beneath the desk hummed softly, and the faint metallic rhythm followed it a moment later, slow, deliberate, echoing faintly through the valley. Steel wheels on rails. There was no mistaking it now. I stood up slowly and walked toward the office window. My hand rested against the cold glass as I looked down the track that disappeared into the forest east of the station. At first, there was nothing there but darkness. The rails reflected a thin line of moonlight before vanishing between the trees. The forest beyond them looked completely still, but the sound was still coming, and it was getting closer. The strange thing was the speed. Trains that passed through towns usually moved quickly unless they were slowing down to stop at the station. But this one wasn't approaching like that. The rhythm of the wheels suggested something much slower, almost cautious. The kind of pace you would expect from a train moving across unfamiliar tracks. Except the tracks outside the station hadn't carried a train in years. I stepped outside onto the platform. The cold air bit immediately against my face, and my breath turned to fog as I exhaled. The valley felt strangely quiet. Even the forest seemed to have gone still, as if the trees themselves were listening. Standing there in the open air, the sound was clearer. Steel wheels grinding slowly against rails somewhere out in the darkness. For a moment I considered the possibility that a maintenance crew had been sent down the line without notifying the station. It wasn't impossible. Railway companies sometimes moved equipment late at night to avoid interfering with active routes. But even then, someone should have answered the radio when I called earlier. And there was something else that didn't feel right. Maintenance vehicles don't usually move like that. Slow, heavy, measured. I walked to the edge of the platform and stared down the track. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then I saw it. Far beyond the trees where the rails curved through the forest, a faint glow appeared in the darkness. At first, it was barely visible, a small point of white light flickering between the branches. I blinked, trying to make sure I wasn't imagining it, but the light remained, and slowly, steadily, it began to grow brighter. The beam moved forward along the track, cutting a narrow path through the trees as it approached the station. My stomach tightened as the realization settled in. That light was coming from the front of a locomotive, which meant something was traveling down that abandoned railway line, something large enough to carry a full train engine. The headlight continued pushing through the forest until it illuminated the rails leading directly toward the station platform. By that point, there was no doubt left. A train was approaching the station, and according to every railway record that existed, that train shouldn't have been there at all. The headlight continued growing brighter as it moved between the trees, slowly illuminating the rails ahead of it. Within seconds, the beam reached the open stretch of track leading toward the station platform. I stood there watching it approach, my breath hanging in the cold air as the vibration in the rails grew stronger beneath my boots. By that point, there was no doubt left in my mind. Whatever was coming down that railway line wasn't some loose equipment or maintenance vehicle. It was a train. The locomotive finally emerged from the forest. At first, all I could see was the blinding white beam of the headlight cutting across the platform. But as the engine rolled closer, the shape of the locomotive slowly came into view behind it. And the moment I saw it clearly, something about it felt wrong. Not damaged, not broken, just wrong. The locomotive looked older than any train I had seen operating in years. Its metal body was heavy and angular, the kind of design common decades earlier when rail engines were built like massive steel machines rather than the sleeker models used in the 70s. The paint along the side had faded to a dull gray, and streaks of rust ran down the metal panels like dark veins. Then I noticed the emblem on the side of the engine. A railway company logo I recognized immediately. But not from any train that still ran through the region. I had only seen that symbol once before, on an old photograph hanging inside the station office, a photograph dated 1948. The locomotive rolled past the station platform slowly, almost cautiously, as if it were testing the condition of the tracks beneath it. I expected to hear the deep mechanical rumble of the engine working to pull the train forward, the powerful churning of machinery that normally echoes through the ground when a locomotive passes by. But there was no roar, no thunder of machinery, just the steady metallic rhythm of wheels touching rails. It was the quietest train I had ever seen moving. As the engine passed the station building, the beam from the headlights swept across the platform and the office windows behind me before disappearing into the darkness beyond town. The first passenger car followed immediately behind it, and that was when the situation became even stranger. Because the windows of that passenger car were completely dark, I stepped closer to the edge of the platform as the car passed in front of the station lights. The reflection of the lights slid across the glass, briefly illuminating the interior. Rows of seats, old fabric benches arranged along the sides of the aisle. But every one of them was empty. No passengers, no luggage, nothing. The second car followed behind it, then the third. Each one looked exactly the same. Dark windows, silent interiors, empty rows of seats disappearing into the shadows. I began walking slowly alongside the platform as the train passed, keeping pace with the cars so I could see inside the windows longer. Every car looked abandoned. Something about that made my skin prickle. Trains weren't meant to feel empty like that. Even late-night passenger trains usually carried someone. A traveler sleeping by the window, a conductor walking through the aisle, the faint glow of reading lights illuminating the seats. But this train carried none of that. It moved through the station like a hollow shell. Car after car passed the platform the same way. Dark windows, silent interiors, empty seats, and the train never slowed down. It didn't sound a horn. It didn't signal the station. It didn't acknowledge the platform at all. But as the next passenger car reached the station lights, something inside one of the windows shifted. Just for a moment. A shadow moved across the far end of the aisle. At first I thought it might have been my reflection in the glass. But as the window slid closer beneath the station lights, I realized something that made my chest tighten. The train wasn't completely empty. Someone was inside one of the cars. At first I thought the movement inside the train might have been a reflection. The station lights behind me were dim and uneven, and sometimes they bounced strangely off the glass of the passing windows. I had seen that happen before when cars passed the station during the day. Reflections can shift and distort shapes in ways that make your mind fill in details that aren't really there. But this felt different, because the shadow had moved in a way reflections don't. I stepped closer to the platform edge and began walking alongside the train again. The cars were moving slowly enough that I could keep pace if I matched my steps to the rhythm of the wheels. The next window slid under the station lights, and I leaned toward the glass trying to see deeper into the car. Empty seats, dark aisle, nothing there. Another window passed, then another. Each one showed the same silent interior. Rows of worn seats stretching toward the back of the car, their fabric faded and stiff with age. Dust floated faintly through the air whenever the station light briefly illuminated the interior. No movement, no passengers, just shadows filling the spaces between the seats. Then the next window reached the station lights, and that was when I saw it clearly. At the far end of the car, someone was sitting in one of the seats, a single figure, perfectly still. The light from the platform barely reached that part of the car, so I couldn't see the face clearly. All I could make out was the outline of a person sitting upright, their shoulders squared and their head slightly tilted toward the aisle. The figure wasn't moving, not shifting, not even adjusting their posture the way someone normally would during a long ride. They just sat there, motionless. For a moment, I thought about knocking on the glass. The idea came to me almost instinctively. If someone was on that train, maybe they needed help. Maybe something had happened further down the line and the train had been diverted through the valley as part of some emergency reroute. But something about the stillness of that figure stopped me. It didn't look like someone riding a train. It looked like someone waiting. I continued walking beside the window as the car slid past the station lights, trying to get a better look before the darkness swallowed it again. The reflection of the platform lights moved across the glass, briefly illuminating the figure a little more clearly. And that was when something happened that made me step back from the platform. The figure moved, slowly. The head turned toward the window. Toward me. The movement was deliberate, almost mechanical, as if the person had been sitting perfectly still until that exact moment. My heart jumped in my chest, because the moment the figure turned its head, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. It had already been facing the window. For a brief second, the station light reflected off the glass just enough to illuminate the shape of the face, but not clearly, not enough to see eyes or features, just a pale outline where a face should have been. And then the window slid past the station lights. The interior of the car disappeared back into darkness. I ran a few steps down the platform trying to keep up with the train as the last cars approached the station. But the farther the cars moved beyond the lights, the harder it became to see anything inside the windows. The final car rolled past the platform. Then the locomotive beam vanished between the trees at the far end of the valley. Within seconds, the sound of the wheels began fading into the distance. The train disappeared into the forest the same way it had arrived. Slowly, silently, leaving nothing behind but the empty railway tracks stretching into the darkness. And the unsettling realization that someone had been sitting inside that train, watching the station as it passed through. For several minutes after the train disappeared into the forest, I remained standing on the platform, staring down the empty rails. The cold air felt heavier now, and the silence that followed the train's passing seemed deeper than the quiet that had come before it. The tracks stretched into the darkness exactly the way they always had, silent, motionless, and abandoned. But I knew what I had heard, and I knew what I had seen. Eventually, the cold forced me back inside the station office. The first thing I did was check the station logs. Every train that passed through the railway network was supposed to appear somewhere in the system, either in the schedule or in a maintenance report. Even if a train wasn't stopping at the station, it still had to be documented somewhere. I opened the large ledger book on the desk and began flipping through the pages. Freight schedules, maintenance reports, inspection records from months earlier. But there was nothing about a train passing through the station that night. In fact, there was nothing about any train using that line at all. I tried the radio again. The old communication unit crackled softly when I turned it on. I picked up the microphone and contacted the Central Railway office, explaining that I had just seen a full passenger train moving along the inactive line near our town. I waited for someone to answer. The speaker responded with nothing but empty static. I tried again. Still nothing. Eventually, I set the microphone down and looked back out the window toward the tracks. The rails were completely still again, as if the train had never passed through. By the time morning arrived, I had almost convinced myself that I must have misunderstood what I had seen. But in a small town, unusual things don't stay quiet for long. When the first few workers passed the station on their way to the lumberyard that morning, they noticed the lights still on inside the office and stopped to ask if anything unusual had happened overnight. I told them about the train. Most of them laughed. They assumed I must have seen some kind of maintenance equipment or railway inspection vehicle moving along the line. But one man who had been listening quietly near the doorway didn't laugh. His name was Harold Bennett. Harold had lived in town longer than almost anyone else. He had worked on the railway decades earlier, back when trains still passed through the valley every day. When I finished describing what I had seen, Harold didn't look surprised. He just asked me a question. "What time did it pass through?" he said. I told him it was around 2:30 in the morning. Harold nodded slowly. Then he looked out the station window toward the tracks. For several seconds he didn't say anything. Then he said something that made the room fall completely silent. "You're not the first person who's seen that train." At first I thought he was joking, but Harold's expression didn't change. He pulled out a chair beside the desk and sat down like someone preparing to explain something important. According to him, people in town had been talking about that train for years. Not every winter, not every decade, but every once in a while someone would claim they saw an old passenger train moving slowly through the valley late at night. The stories always sounded the same. A train appearing on the abandoned railway line. Dark windows, no passengers visible, no lights inside the cars, and no record of the train ever appearing on any railway schedule. It would simply pass through town and disappear down the tracks. I asked Harold if anyone had ever reported those sightings to the railway company. He nodded. "More than once," he said. But the answer was always the same. According to the railway records, no trains had ever been scheduled to use that line during the hours people reported seeing it. No freight runs, no maintenance crews, nothing. Then Harold told me something I hadn't expected. He said the first time people reported seeing that train happened shortly after a major railway accident near our town decades earlier. A passenger train had derailed somewhere along the same stretch of track during a winter storm. Several cars left the rails, and according to the official reports, dozens of passengers had been on board that train that night. I asked him what happened to them. Harold hesitated before answering. Then he looked back out the station window toward the empty rails stretching into the forest. "The wreck was found," he said quietly, "but the passengers weren't." After hearing Harold's story, I couldn't stop thinking about the train accident he mentioned. If something like that had really happened on the same stretch of railway, there had to be records somewhere. Railway companies document everything, especially derailments involving passenger trains. So a few days later, on my next day off, I drove to the regional railway archives in the nearest city. The building stored decades of old reports, maintenance records, and accident files. If that train had derailed near our town the way Harold described, I knew I would eventually find something about it there. It took most of the afternoon, but eventually I did find it. The report was dated January 1949. According to the document, a passenger train traveling through the valley had lost control during a severe winter storm shortly after 2 in the morning. The rails had iced over during the night, and somewhere along the wooded stretch of track just outside our town, several cars had jumped the rails and slid into the snow-covered embankment beside the forest. But the strangest part wasn't the derailment itself. It was what the rescue crews found when they reached the train. The locomotive was still there. 2 of the passenger cars had overturned. Another had partially slid off the tracks. But when the rescue teams opened the cars to look for survivors, they discovered something that immediately confused everyone involved in the investigation. The train was empty, completely empty. According to the passenger manifest, more than 40 people had been aboard the train that night. Yet when the wreckage was searched, none of them were found inside the cars. No bodies, no injured passengers wandering through the snow, no signs that anyone had escaped into the forest. Search teams spent days combing the woods surrounding the crash site. They found luggage, suitcases, personal belongings scattered inside the cars. But the passengers themselves had vanished, as if they had simply disappeared. Eventually, the railway company concluded that the passenger manifest must have been incorrect. They assumed the train had been carrying far fewer passengers than originally recorded. The case was quietly closed, the wreckage cleared from the tracks, and the accident faded into the long history of railway incidents that most people eventually forget. But when I read the description of that train in the report, a chill ran down my spine, because the locomotive and passenger cars described in that document looked exactly like the train I had seen passing through the station platform that night. The same heavy engine, the same old passenger cars, the same faded company emblem from decades earlier. I continued working at the station for 2 more years after that night, and during that time I never saw the train again. The tracks remained silent. The valley stayed quiet. Eventually the railway company sold the land, and the old station building was demolished to make room for a new highway access road. Today there's almost nothing left to show that the station ever existed at all. Just a narrow strip of gravel where the platform once stood. But every once in a while, when winter settles over the valley and the nights grow quiet again, someone in town will claim they heard something moving along the old railway line late at night. A distant metallic rhythm echoing through the forest. Steel wheels rolling slowly across rails that no train should be using anymore. Whenever I hear those stories, I remember the night I stood on that platform watching the dark passenger cars pass through the station lights. I remember the empty seats inside the train, and the silhouette sitting at the far end of that car. Because the strangest part about that train wasn't that it appeared on an abandoned railway line. The strangest part was the way it moved. Slow, silent, as if it had traveled those rails many times before, and would probably travel them again. So if you ever find yourself near an old railway line during a quiet winter night, listen carefully, because sometimes the tracks that people believe were abandoned long ago still carry something through the darkness. And when that train passes through the valley, it never stops at the station. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more mysterious cases like this one, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Here on Inside the Mystery Archive, we explore strange stories, forgotten reports, and unexplained events hidden deep inside old records. And before you go, I'd love to know something. What city and country are you watching from tonight? Let me know in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. And if you stay long enough on this channel, you might just discover another mystery waiting inside the archive.